Good afternoon. Today, this is going to be one of our final videos, and I will be speaking to you about Aristotle's categories. Before I start speaking about the categories, however, I want to pick up on an issue left over from last class. This has to do with a clarification concerning Zeno's argument. Now, Zeno tells us the following. This is what Socrates says to him. Zeno, what do you mean by this? If things are many, they must then be both like and unlike, but that is impossible because unlike things can't be like or like things unlike. Now, that paradox is generated by not distinguishing between different senses of is, namely the is of identity and the is of predication. If we think that when we talk about many things as being like and unlike, what we are talking about is the is of identity, then of course we will wind up with a contradiction, because we're going to be saying that they just are two contradictory things. Now, how does Plato solve this problem? He solves it through his theory of the forms, and the idea that a single particular can participate in multiple forms. And through this theory of participation, what we have then is a kind of an understanding of the is of predication. A single thing can participate in multiple forms, and even forms that may be seem to be contradictory to one another, because we can distinguish between the respects in which a thing will participate in one form or another. So, for instance, in one respect, I can consider myself one person. And in another respect, I can consider myself as having many parts insofar as I have a body with parts. This is the example that is used by Socrates in the Parmenides. Right, so it's important to think of or to distinguish the respects in which something can be said to have a particular characteristic or relation. The thing remains the same, but it can have multiple predicates. Now, in my last video, I spoke of several of the paradoxes that are generated when we think of the forms as having a separate ontological existence. These were detailed by the character Parmenides, who tells the young Socrates that he just hasn't thought through all of the implications of his theory of the forms, and that there are significant puzzles with this theory. Now, it's in thinking of a lot of those puzzles that we can seg into Aristotle and his categories. One of the most fundamental and important thing to understand about Aristotle is that Aristotle is going to deny that the forms have an independent ontological existence. For Aristotle, the things that are most fundamentally real are the substances. This is again different from Plato, who thinks that the forms are what is most fundamentally real, and that the world of appearances is simply that, a world of these shadowy things that only acquire whatever characteristics and reality they have in virtue of that relationship with those forms. For Aristotle, on the other hand, what are the things that are fundamentally real? They are the individual plants and animals and persons that exist in this world. And his term for this is substance, ousia, O-U-S-I-A, and that is again his term for an independently existing entity. They are what is most real. Now, in the categories, and in fact, in a lot of Aristotle's theoretical works, what he's going to be concerned with is the giving of an account of what it is for something to be a substance. So we need to, for instance, give an account of what it is for something to be an animal. And this giving an account is a definition. Now, let's put that in the background as we look at what Aristotle is going to be doing in the categories. video with the issue of kinds of predication that are brought up at the beginning of the Parmenides. And let's think about that and think about these kinds of predication in relation to what Aristotle is telling us. Aristotle is going to say, tells us that among the things that are, he said, some things are said of a subject, but are not in a subject. And he tells us, for example, man is said of a subject, the individual man, but is not in any subject. And some are in a subject, but are not said of any subject. Okay, so we need to distinguish just to figure out what is it that he's trying to tell us here. What does it mean to say that something is said of a subject, but is not in a subject, and something isn't in a subject, but not said of a subject? So let's begin with the second one first. What does it mean to be in a subject? First, note that he says that he calls in a subject what cannot exist separately from what it is in. Now, the example of what is said of something that is something being said in a subject would be something like whiteness. So we say Socrates is white. That is his example of something being said in a subject. Note that contra Plato, Aristotle is going to tell us that whiteness does not exist apart from the substance that has the whiteness. Okay, so there is no independently existing form of whiteness. Now, when we say that something exists in a subject, the way to understand this and the way to understand the distinction between being said of a subject and being in a subject, the two are closely akin to the issue of the is of identity and the is of predication. When something is merely in a subject, we merely predicate that thing of the subject. So we say Socrates is white. Now, that is to be distinguished from the kind of predication where we have a kind of identity. We say Socrates is a man. When we say Socrates is a man, being a man is said of the subject. Now, let's look at the differences here. When we look at what whiteness is, we say whiteness is a color. Okay? Socrates is not a color. Okay, so in other words, when something is in a subject, that characteristic does not identify the subject, and the definition of the characteristic does not apply to the subject. So white is a color, right? But we cannot say that Socrates is a color, right? So that's what it is to predicate, to say something to say that something is in a subject. Now, when something is said of a subject, this is really going to be more like that is of identity. Why? Well, we say Socrates is a man, and let's look at the definition of man. Well, man is an animal. Part of the definition of being a man is also to be an animal. And we can say that Socrates is an animal. So contra the way that we predicate, the kind of predication that we have when something is merely in a subject, when something is said of a subject, what it is that is being said of the subject, the definition of that thing applies to the subject. So again, there we have something more akin to the is of identity versus the is of predication. So again, let's look at another example. If I say that Socrates is a mammal, right, we can look at the definition of mammal as a warm-blooded animal. And it will also be true of Socrates that he is warm-blooded. Now let's look at another case that Aristotle speaks of. He says that Some things are both said of a subject and are in a subject, and he uses the example of knowledge. So knowledge can be in a subject. When we say Socrates is knowledgeable, we are predicating knowledge of Socrates as it being in a subject. Why? Because we cannot identify Socrates with the knowledge that Socrates has. On the other hand, we can say that grammar is a kind of knowledge, and then everything that we say about knowledge can also be said about grammar, because there's a sense in which that the subject of grammar, insofar as it can be known, is a kind of knowledge. Now, importantly, the individuals, the individual animals, the individual trees, tables and chairs, the things in this world, those are neither said of a subject nor are in a subject. And it is with these individuals that Aristotle is most principally concerned. These individuals are what he calls primary ousia. They are the primary substances. And again, everything is predicated of the primary substances. So let's see what he says about these primary substances. And we see that at 2a, around 12, right after, that would be right after 5, that division 5 in your book. He tells us substance in the most proper sense of the substance in the most proper sense of the word, that which is primarily and most of all called substance, is neither said of any subject, nor is it in any subject. For example, the individual man and the individual horse. Again, the individuals are the primary substances, and these are to be distinguished from what he calls the secondary substances. And this is what is said of a subject. So when we talk about a man, right, we say Socrates is a man. This is man there is a secondary substance. And as he notes, these are both the species, which the things primarily called substances are, but they can also be the genera. So what do we mean by this? Socrates falls under the species man and under the genus of the species animal. So when we talk about the genus, it's going to be part of the definition, let's say, of the species. If the species is man, all men are animals. And notice that there can be other species. There can be the species of cats or dogs, right? Or crocodiles. And all of those species will also be animals. Again, if Socrates is a man, or let's say that Socrates is a mammal, as we noted before, the definition of that kind of being will also apply to Socrates. So Socrates is warm-blooded. Socrates is an animal. Fido, let's say, we can say Fido is a dog. And since all dogs are animals, Fido will also be an animal. So anything that belongs to the definition of the species, which is said of a subject, is also going to be true of the primary substance. So here we have again the distinction between the primary substance, which are the individuals, and the secondary substance, which has to do with the kind of individual that it is, but which identifies it, right? The secondary substance is going to identify the individual as an individual of a particular sort. And again, that definition everything that is true of that definition, or that is contained in that definition, all the marks are going to be true of the primary substance. Now let's look at what Aristotle says at 2a35. He notes, all other things are either said of primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. So again, this is the distinction between said of a subject and in a subject. And he says he classifies all of them Everything that can be said, that can be true, as either being said of a substance or as in a substance. In other words, as said of a primary substance or as in a primary substance. And then he tells us, this is evident from a consideration of cases. For example, animal is predicated of man, and therefore of the individual man. For if it were predicated of no individual man, it would not be predicated of man at all. So again, it has to be predicated of an individual man. Again, color is in body, and therefore in an individual body. For if it were not in any individual, it would not be in any body at all. And here, very importantly, this is what he says, thus, all other things are either said of primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. Therefore, if there were no primary substances, there could not be anything else. Now again, this is where he differs from Plato. He's saying that if there are no primary substances, like the individuals in this world, nothing else would exist. So the things that we predicate, the secondary substances, and let's say the qualities that we predicate, those only exist insofar as they are true of individuals. And that's what he's saying there when he says that if there were no primary substances, there could not be anything else. Those things just do not, the whiteness does not have an independent existence apart from its existence in the particular subject. The idea of, or the manhood, let's say, remember, Plato thinks that there's such a thing as an idea of man or a form of man, and that it has an independent existence. Aristotle's going to say, no, it doesn't. It only has an existence insofar as it is in, or it can be predicated of, the individual, this particular individual man. So then at 2b15 note, he says, further, primary substances are subjects for all other things. This is the same idea that he's going on about. And all other things are predicated of them or are in them, and it is for this reason they are called substances most of all. Okay, that's why they're called, that is why they're called primary ousia. Notice he also says each substance, what is a substance? Each substance seems to signify a particular this. So it is this can of water, or this pen, or this individual here, right? So that is what the primary substances are. It's an individual this, an individual particular, not a general term. That's actually at 3b12 again, and so when he says that each substance seems to signify a particular this, he says, for what is indicated is individual and one in number. Next, what he tells us about these primary substances is very important. He says at 3b24, he tells us, it is also characteristic of substances not to have contraries. Okay, so what do we mean by that? We've already looked at the idea of contraries when we were looking at the pre-Socratics. We talked about the hot and the cold, those kinds of opposites, right? Those are the contraries. And he says, look, when we talk about substances, these substances that are the primary ousia, they do not have contraries. So the individual man, Socrates, does not have any kind of contrary, like a not Socrates or something like that. He just is the individual man. On the other hand, when we talk about hot and cold, those are contraries. Now that idea is going to be very important. And then at 4a10, he's going to tell us that most characteristic of substances seems to be the fact that something that is one and the same in number can receive contraries, right? So there is no contrary to Socrates. But Socrates can receive contraries in the sense that Socrates can one day be pale and another day be tan, right? So he can change. The water, right? This water here can at one moment be cold, and it can be heated, and it can become hot. So it is receiving the contraries. So here we have then two things to keep in mind. We have the individual substance on the one hand, and then the states of that individual substance. So is it in a state of hotness, or is it in a state of coldness? And that individual substance changes. When it changes, it receives it changes state. It goes from one state to its contrary state. So importantly, Aristotle tells us in no other case can one cite something, one in number, that is able to receive contraries. The only case is in the case of primary ousia. So, for example, a color that is one and the same in number will not be white and black, but a substance, one and the same in number, can receive contraries. Now, again, it is in the case of substances, he says at 4a30, that it is because they change that they are able to receive the contraries. Now, one of the fundamental projects in Aristotle's theoretical works is an attempt to identify these primary substances. Why is the identification of the primary substances an issue? Well, it's an issue because they are constantly changing. So we need to understand, and what is it that changes? It's the contraries or the states of the object that change, or of the primary substance. But then how are we going to relate those changes that the substance undergoes to what we call the substance? How are we going to then understand the definition of that substance? So one of the problems is going to be, when we're trying to define this primary substance, is to try to figure out that in virtue of which we can think of that substance, that primary substance, as identical with itself as it undergoes these changes. And this is the issue that he is going to be dealing with in the physics.